The story of how the United States of America could have looked vastly different is a tale of forgotten histories and missed opportunities. The lines that now define each state were not always as clear as they are today. New Jersey was once divided into two halves, East and West Jersey. Kentucky began as a sprawling backyard of Virginia. Connecticut once harbored grand ambitions, staking a claim all the way to the Mississippi River. These shapes, borders, and identities that we now take for granted were shaped by a complex and often unexpected history. What we now see on the map as neat boundaries owes a great deal to chance and circumstance. A slight shift in events could have led to the carving up of the nation into very different political entities than the ones we have today. Before Oklahoma became the state we know, it was Indian Territory, land given to displaced Native American tribes. Forcibly removed from their ancestral homelands, only to have that land later eyed by white settlers eager for their own piece of it. Oklahoma's fate was no stranger to fierce disputes about who could truly claim it. And for one brief moment in the early 20th century, it seemed that a solution had been found, a plan to create not just one, but two Oklahomas, one for the Native Americans and one for white settlers. Both sides supported this idea, a state for Native Americans governed by their own indigenous leaders, and another for the growing population of white settlers. But the state that was envisioned, Sequoyah, never came into existence. Today, we unravel the story of Sequoyah, the state that nearly was, but never came to be. As the U.S. expanded westward in the 19th century, Native American tribes were increasingly forced from their lands. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson, authorized the relocation of native tribes from their ancestral lands in the southeastern U.S. to lands west of the Mississippi River. These lands would become known as Indian Territory, a space set aside for displaced tribes. The forced migration of these tribes, known as the Trail of Tears, is one of the darkest chapters in U.S. history, during which approximately 100,000 Native Americans were driven from their homes, many at gunpoint. They were made to walk hundreds of miles to their new home, a barren land in present-day Oklahoma. These lands, far from the fertile regions they had once known, were a harsh and unforgiving environment. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole tribes, collectively known as the Five Civilized Tribes, were among those forcibly relocated. Their new home in Indian Territory was meant to be a place where they could live without interference, but this was not to be. As the years passed, the U.S. government reneged on its promises, and Indian Territory was gradually whittled away, with more and more land taken from the tribes and sold to white settlers. By the late 19th century, Indian Territory had shrunk to a fraction of its original size, corresponding roughly to the eastern half of what we now know as Oklahoma. But the tribes were still fighting to retain some semblance of autonomy over their lands. In the early 1900s, the Five Civilized Tribes convened a meeting with a bold proposal to turn Indian Territory into its own state. A Native American-governed state they called Sequoyah, named after the Cherokee leader who had developed their written language. This proposed state would have given Native Americans control over their own lands, while still being part of the United States. The plan was ambitious. Delegates from the tribes met in Muskogee in 1905 to draft a constitution for Sequoyah. The constitution laid out a framework for self-governance, with a map dividing the territory into 48 counties. It was a vision of sovereignty within the larger framework of the U.S., one where Native Americans could maintain control over their destiny, their lands, and their futures. Sequoyah would have been a state like no other, born from a desire to preserve the rights and culture of its indigenous inhabitants. The referendum for statehood was a resounding success within Indian Territory. Both Native Americans and white settlers who had moved into the area supported the creation of Sequoyah. For Native Americans, Sequoyah was a way to protect what little land they had left and to create a political entity where they would have control. For white settlers, it was a chance to build a new state from the ground up, with the backing of a constitution and government. The proposal was put to a vote, and the people of Indian Territory overwhelmingly approved the constitution and petition for statehood. However, despite the local support, the Sequoyah statehood proposal would face an insurmountable obstacle in Washington, D.C. Congress never voted on the proposal, and the vision of Sequoyah began to fade. The reasons for the failure of Sequoyah are rooted in the political realities of the time. The federal government was unwilling to create a state that would give Native Americans such a large degree of autonomy. There were fears that allowing Sequoyah to become a state would set a precedent, leading other Native American tribes to demand their own states. Additionally, Oklahoma Territory, located to the west of Indian Territory, was also seeking statehood at the same time. The U.S. government saw an opportunity to merge the two territories into a single state, rather than allow them to be divided along racial lines. The Curtis Act of 1898 had already laid the groundwork for the eventual dissolution of tribal governments, and by 1907, the idea of a Native American-governed state had been sidelined. Instead, Indian Territory and Oklahoma Territory were merged into one, and on November 16, 1907, Oklahoma became the 46th state of the United States. The dream of Sequoyah was over. The creation of Oklahoma came at a high price for Native Americans. With the merging of the two territories, the tribal governments were dissolved, and the allotment of land, which had begun in the 1880s, continued apace. Under the allotment system, tribal lands were divided into small parcels, which were then assigned to individual Native American families. The idea was to encourage Native Americans to adopt the farming lifestyle of white settlers, but in practice, many Native Americans were forced to sell their land to survive, and large portions of Indian Territory ended up in the hands of white settlers and the U.S. government. The creation of Oklahoma marked the end of Native American sovereignty in the region. The lands that had once been promised to the tribes as a permanent home were now open to settlement and development. The 5 civilized tribes, who had once ruled over vast territories, were now reduced to a minority within a new state that bore little resemblance to the autonomous homeland they had once envisioned. Yet, the legacy of Sequoyah lives on. The Constitution drafted in Muskogee is a testament to the determination of Native Americans to fight for their rights and preserve their culture in the face of overwhelming odds. Though Sequoyah never became a state, it remains a symbol of what could have been, a place where Native Americans could govern themselves and maintain control over their lands. Today, Oklahoma is a state with a large Native American population, and many of the tribes that once called Indian Territory home continue to thrive in the region. Tribal governments have been re-established, and the struggle for Native American rights continues. The story of Sequoyah is a reminder that history is not always inevitable. Had the winds of politics blown a little differently, the map of the United States could have looked very different. Instead of Oklahoma, we might be talking about Sequoyah today. The intricate political landscape that shaped the United States was rife with clashes of power, cultural identity, and territorial ambitions. The proposed state of Sequoyah, an Indian-led state envisioned to exist alongside the predominantly white-governed Oklahoma Territory, was more than a mere proposal. It was a manifestation of a deeper struggle for Native American sovereignty, autonomy, and recognition in a rapidly transforming nation. At the heart of this conflict were political concerns that transcended local governance. Even as Native and white leaders in Indian Territory rallied for the creation of Sequoyah, powerful forces in Washington were moving against them. Among these was President Theodore Roosevelt and a Republican-led Congress. Their apprehensions stemmed from the territory's history of alliances with the South, sparking fears that any new state carved from Indian Territory might tilt the balance of power toward the Democrats. But there was more at play here than just political maneuvering. Historian Barbara A. Mann points out a deeper resistance rooted in racial and cultural dynamics. The idea of Sequoyah, governed by Native Americans, was unpalatable to many white lawmakers who desired a state that would reflect and enforce white dominance. To these legislators, the thought of a state where Native Americans held the reins of power was simply unacceptable. Eastern representatives, too, had their reasons for opposing the move. They were concerned that the addition of another Western state would erode their own political influence, potentially shifting the balance of power within the House of Representatives. Southern Democrats, on the other hand, feared that Oklahoma would enter the Union with a strong Republican base, further destabilizing their grip on the region. Meanwhile, some detractors argued that the region's small size and limited resources made it unsuitable for statehood. further complicating the matter. Up until 1903, even the tribes of Indian Territory had been resistant to the notion of statehood. The 5 tribes, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, and other native nations were wary of both local and national efforts to impose statehood upon them, whether through a merger with Oklahoma Territory or as a standalone entity. For these tribes, the very idea of statehood threatened their autonomy and the fragile sovereignty they still maintained. However, the Curtis Act of 1898 loomed large over their future. This legislation prescribed the eventual dissolution of tribal governments by March 4, 1906, leaving the tribes with little choice but to reconsider their opposition to statehood. With the deadline fast approaching, and faced with the reality of joint statehood with Oklahoma Territory, the tribes relented. Instead of Sequoyah, Congress passed the Oklahoma Enabling Act in 1906, settling the long-standing debate by paving the way for a unified state that combined both Oklahoma and Indian territories. On November 16, 1907, Oklahoma officially became the 46th state of the Union. But the story didn't end there. The struggles of the Native American tribes in Oklahoma continued, even as the new state took shape. More than 13% of Oklahomans today are Native American, giving the state the second largest Native American population in the country. And yet, despite these numbers, debates have persisted over whether the eastern region of Oklahoma can still be considered native land. Over the years, more and more allotments of land, initially designated to Native Americans, were sold off or seized by the state for the payment of taxes. This issue came to a head in 2020 with the landmark U.S. Supreme Court case McGirt v. Oklahoma. The case revolved around Jim C. McGirt, a Seminole man convicted of a crime in 1996. His legal team argued that the state of Oklahoma had no jurisdiction to prosecute him, as the crime was committed on land that had been promised to the Muskogee Creek Nation in treaties dating back to the 1830s. In a 5-4 ruling, the Supreme Court sided with McGirt, affirming that much of eastern Oklahoma, including Tulsa, still fell under the jurisdiction of Native American reservations. The ruling was hailed as a victory by Native American tribes in the region, recognizing their continued sovereignty over the lands that had been promised to them so many years ago. For the Muskogee Creek Nation, and many other tribes, the ruling was a long overdue acknowledgement of their rights and promises made by the U.S. government that had been repeatedly broken. "Many folks are in tears," said Janadev Chowdhury, the Muskogee Creek Nation's ambassador, after the ruling. For Native American citizens in Oklahoma, the decision was seen as a step toward reclaiming the sovereignty they had fought for, even if the state of Sequoyah had never materialized. The concept of an Indian-governed state has lingered in the imaginations of many, even making its way into popular culture. Harry Turtledove, an alternate history writer, revived the idea in his novel, How Few Remain, where Indian Territory becomes a Confederate state known as Sequoyah. However, the reality of Oklahoma today is far different from this fictional world. Oklahoma is now a blend of Native and Western cultures, with a unique history that reflects its complicated past. The state remains home to over 50 Native tribal headquarters, more than any other state. And a quarter of Oklahoma's white and black populations have some Native American ancestry. The capital of the Cherokee Nation, Tahlequah, is located in eastern Oklahoma, where Native Americans continue to play a vital role in the state's cultural and political landscape. Interestingly, Oklahoma's name itself is a tribute to its Native American heritage. Chief Allen Wright of the Choctaw Nation coined the name during treaty negotiations in 1866, with Oklahoma translating to red people in the Choctaw language. Initially, the name was applied only to the unassigned lands in central Oklahoma, but over time, it came to represent the entire state. The story of Sequoyah may have ended with Oklahoma's admission to the Union, but its legacy continues in the ongoing struggles for Native American sovereignty and recognition. The dream of a Native-governed state might have been dashed by political forces over a century ago, but the fight for autonomy and self-governance persists. Today, the tribes of Oklahoma have regained some of their sovereignty through legal victories. And the story of Sequoyah serves as a reminder of the potential paths that history might have taken. The history of Oklahoma, however, is not just a Native American story. Another unique chapter in U.S. history is tied to the prehistory of Utah and the Mormons' quest for a state of their own. After the U.S. signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo with Mexico in 1848, effectively annexing large portions of the Southwest, Mormon settlers saw an opportunity to shape the new territory. By July 1849, the Mormons had convened a constitutional convention and drafted a constitution for the proposed state of Deseret. This massive state would have encompassed all of modern Utah, Nevada, Arizona, Southern California, and parts of Colorado and Oregon, making it a sprawling, powerful entity in the American West. Deseret, much like Sequoyah, never came to fruition. But its constitution, based on the Constitution of Iowa, outlined a vision for governance that included a separation of powers, a militia, and civil rights for its citizens. Though the Mormons had hoped Deseret would become a state, the U.S. government had other plans, eventually carving the region into smaller territories and denying the Mormons their dream. Like Sequoyah, Deseret remains a fascinating what-if in American history. Ultimately, the stories of Sequoyah and Deseret illustrate how fragile and contingent the history of the United States truly is. Both proposals represented bold attempts to forge new paths for governance in the American frontier. Paths that were ultimately thwarted by the complex interplay of politics, race, and power. Yet, the legacies of these forgotten states live on, offering a glimpse of the diverse, multicultural nation that might have been. Today, Oklahoma stands as a testament to the resilience of Native American tribes, while Utah remains a hub of Mormon culture. These states, like the people who dreamed of them, continue to shape the identity of the nation in ways both profound and unexpected. The intricate history of states that never were provides a fascinating glimpse into the nation's turbulent and unpredictable early years. One such state was Deseret, a state envisioned by the Mormon settlers in the vast wilderness of the American West. At first glance, the establishment of Deseret seemed like a logical extension of the Mormons' quest for autonomy and religious freedom after their journey westward. However, the notion of statehood was far from straightforward. While the Mormons had complete political control over their community, this was not necessarily seen as an advantage by Congress. In fact, it was a point of contention. The U.S. government harbored deep prejudice against the newly formed religion, making the prospect of a Mormon-governed state unpalatable. Congress preferred a federal territory where the governor could be handpicked by the president, ensuring greater control and oversight. The issue wasn't just about religion, though. Deseret's proposed statehood also ran afoul of the growing tensions between free and slave states. The potential admission of a new free state in the West threatened to upset the fragile balance between slave and free states in the Union. As a result, there was significant opposition from pro-slavery factions who did not want another free state to enter the fold. For 2 years, Deseret existed as the de facto governing authority in its borders. But it was dissolved in 1851 when the Utah Territory was officially created. Despite the setback, the Mormons did not abandon their dream of statehood. They made several more unsuccessful attempts to petition for the statehood of Deseret in 1856, 1862, and 1872, but Congress remained unyielding. At the time Deseret's first constitution was drafted, the Mormon community in the West was less than 2 years old. And they did not yet have the infrastructure needed to print their constitution locally. Lacking a printing press, the Constitution was printed in Kanesville, Iowa, the historic starting point of the Mormon Trail westward. From there, several copies of the document were sent to Washington, D.C., in the hopes of securing congressional approval. Today, a rare copy of the Kanesville imprint of the Deseret Constitution, along with a copy of the Constitution of the state of Sequoyah, can be found in the rare book collection of the Law Library of Congress. Deseret was not the only state that never came to fruition. Another forgotten chapter in American history is the short-lived state of Franklin, or Frankland, as it was initially called. Franklin emerged from the tumultuous period following the Revolutionary War in what is now eastern Tennessee. At the time, the region was part of western North Carolina, but the area's wild and mountainous terrain was home to over 5,000 settlers who felt abandoned by their state government. Tensions escalated in 1784 when North Carolina's state legislature withdrew its militias from the region and attempted, unsuccessfully, to cede the land to the federal government. The settlers, constantly threatened by Native American attacks and feeling neglected by the government, declared their counties an independent state, the state of Franklin. They appointed John Sevier, a swashbuckling politician and soldier who had gained fame fighting the Cherokee, as their governor. In a bid to gain the support of one of the most revered figures in American history, the fledgling state was named after Benjamin Franklin. However, despite their efforts, Franklin never garnered the Founding Fathers' backing. Franklin did send a polite letter to John Sevier, but he offered no public support for the breakaway state's cause. The aspiring state of Franklin petitioned Congress for admission to the newly formed United States. But the proposal narrowly fell short of the two-thirds majority required for statehood. Despite the rejection, Franklin continued to operate as an independent republic for several years, complete with its own courts, legislature, taxes, and constitution. However, by 1788, the state of Franklin was struggling. In a bold and desperate move, Sevier made an audacious bid for assistance from Spain, a foreign power. This act of reaching out to Spain for help led to his arrest on charges of treason. The state of Franklin soon collapsed, and the territory was reclaimed by North Carolina. Ultimately, Franklin's lands were ceded to the federal government and became part of the Southwest Territory, which would later become the state of Tennessee. Despite his near-treasonous actions, John Sevier managed to avoid any serious punishment. His legendary reputation as the leader of Franklin helped him secure a prominent role in Tennessee's future, and he would go on to become the state's first governor. The histories of Deseret and Franklin highlight the complex nature of American expansion and statehood. Both states represent bold attempts at creating new political entities in a rapidly changing landscape, and while neither succeeded, they left an indelible mark on the country's history. The Mormons' quest for religious autonomy and the settlers of Franklin's desire for security and self-governance both serve as powerful examples of how diverse groups sought to navigate the challenges of forming new states within the growing republic. And so, we wrap up today's episode, reflecting on the states that could have been but never were. These forgotten stories remind us of the turbulent history of America's expansion and the many different paths that history might have taken. Thank you for joining us once again. We hope you found this episode both informative and engaging. Remember to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you'll be the first to see our upcoming updates. See you in our next video.